In 1844, the island of Cuba was on fire, not from flames, but from fear. Spanish officials whispered of an underground network of enslaved Africans and free people of color plotting to overthrow colonial rule. They called it La Escalera, the ladder, after the brutal torture device used to extract confessions. To the authorities, it was a conspiracy of terror. To those in chains, it was the dream of freedom finally breaking through the silence. The backdrop was a Cuba transformed by sugar. The colony had become the world's leading producer, its wealth pouring into Spanish coffers. But beneath the shimmering riches was a dark truth. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved men and women, ripped from Africa or born into bondage, were forced to labor in the cane fields from sunrise to dusk. For them, life was unrelenting toil, punishment, and despair. Yet, even in the harshest conditions, resistance burned. Whispers moved from plantation to plantation, talk of uprisings, alliances, and courage. In 1844, Spanish authorities claimed they uncovered a massive slave conspiracy. Whether the plot was as large as they feared or inflated to justify mass repression, the result was the same. Arrests, torture, and executions spread across the island. Hundreds were killed, thousands were scarred. But the legacy of La Escalera became something larger, proof that the enslaved in Cuba were not silent, and that even under unimaginable violence, the dream of freedom endured. This is the story of how courage clashed with cruelty, how whispers turned into screams, and how the year 1844 became one of the darkest and most revealing chapters in Cuba's history. By the 1840s, Cuba was both paradise and prison. The island glittered like a jewel of empire, its cane fields rolling out in endless waves of green under the Caribbean sun. Ships lined Havana's harbor, their holds stuffed with sugar, molasses, and rum bound for Europe. In Madrid, merchants toasted their fortunes. In Paris and London, families sweetened their tea without ever asking where the sweetness came from. The answer was here, in Cuba's soil, and in the bent backs of the men and women who worked it. Tens of thousands of enslaved Africans toiled from dawn until dusk, their sweat soaking the fields, their blood hidden in every barrel of sugar. Their lives were measured not in years but in harvests, not in dignity but in output. To the Spanish planters who ruled the island, these people were tools, replaceable, controllable, meant to endure or perish in silence. But silence never truly ruled Cuba. Beneath the crack of the overseer's whip, beneath the hymns of priests blessing empire, another sound lingered. It was the sound of drums played in secret, the murmur of prayers whispered in African tongues, the whispers of plots that no lash could completely erase. The planters feared those whispers. They had seen what happened in Saint-Domingue, where enslaved Africans had risen and torn down the French Empire, building Haiti on its ashes. To them, Haiti was a ghost that stalked every field, every night fire, every restless gathering in the barracks. They told themselves that Cuba was different, that their wealth and power made them secure. But their fear betrayed them. For fear only exists where resistance is possible. By the 1830s and 1840s, resistance was everywhere. On plantations in Matanzas, in Havana's bustling streets, in the coastal towns where free men of color worked as artisans and musicians, the idea of freedom flickered. Some whispered of rebellion, some dreamed of escape, others simply carried the unshakable knowledge that they were more than what the Spanish claimed them to be. Then came 1844, the year history would remember as La Escalera. The name meant the ladder. At first, it was just an object, a wooden frame. But once the year began, the ladder became something else, an instrument of torture, a symbol of fear, the stage upon which countless men and women were tied, whipped, and forced to confess. Spanish officials declared they had uncovered a vast conspiracy, an island-wide plot by enslaved Africans and free people of color to burn Havana, slaughter the white population, and turn Cuba into another Haiti. They said the conspirators had organized in secret, moving messages from plantation to plantation, uniting the cane fields in a single cry of rebellion. Whether this conspiracy was real, exaggerated, or partly invented remains debated by historians. What is not debated is what followed, one of the bloodiest waves of repression in Cuban history. The first arrests began quietly, like sparks in dry cane. Soldiers appeared on plantations at night, dragging men from their beds, questioning overseers, ransacking huts. In Havana, free men of color, teachers, poets, musicians, were seized on accusations of spreading dangerous ideas. Those accused were tied to the ladder. Their wrists and ankles were bound, their backs exposed, and lashes fell until their flesh split. Under the weight of agony, names spilled out, sometimes real, sometimes fabricated. One confession led to another, one name to another, until the web of suspicion grew larger than anyone could contain. The island convulsed in fear. Plantation owners demanded protection. Militia patrols thundered down dirt roads at night, muskets ready, eyes searching the cane fields for signs of uprising. Priests declared the plot a sin against God's order, insisting that obedience was divine and rebellion was damnation. The colonial press printed stories of an African conspiracy, feeding the terror of white society and justifying harsher crackdowns. For the enslaved, the year was not one of conspiracy, but of survival. Whispers became dangerous. A wrong word, a suspicious glance, even the sound of a drum could bring soldiers to your door. In the barracks, families huddled close, their nights broken by sudden raids, their mornings marked by the absence of fathers, sons, or mothers taken away. The lash sang louder than the drums that year. Hundreds were executed, hanged in town squares, shot in fields, left as warnings for others. Thousands were whipped, their scars becoming silent records of what 1844 had meant. For those who lived, the pain lingered far longer than the screams. And yet, even as the Spanish declared victory, something deeper remained. La Escalera was meant to erase rebellion, but instead, it revealed its persistence, because only a people capable of resistance could inspire such fear in their masters. Only the possibility of freedom could drive an empire to such cruelty. Cuba in 1844 was a land split by contradictions. On one side, the glittering mansions of Havana's elites, their gardens filled with imported roses, their ballrooms echoing with European music. On the other, the cane fields stretching endlessly, where men and women labored in mud and sweat, watched over by armed overseers who carried whips and pistols. Every planter lived with the memory of Haiti. They studied reports of Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, and Christophe, the leaders who had turned bondage into revolution. They whispered of another Haiti as if speaking the words could summon the specter. In private, they feared the same fate. In public, they doubled down on cruelty, hoping fear would keep rebellion at bay. But cruelty breeds courage. In the fields, men and women shared stories of ancestors who had fought back in Africa, who had defied kings and resisted enemies. Those memories traveled across the Atlantic with them, surviving in songs, proverbs, and rituals. No lash could erase them. By the early 1840s, Havana was alive with new currents. Free men of color were gaining influence as artisans, musicians, and even intellectuals. They read French books, whispered of liberty, and spread ideas that terrified colonial officials. In the eyes of the Spanish, freedom was contagious, and those who carried ideas were as dangerous as those who carried machetes. So when whispers of a plot surfaced in 1844, the colonial government seized the chance to crush not just rebellion, but the very possibility of it. They called it La Escalera, and under that name, they unleashed terror across the island. The latter became infamous. Prisoners were tied face down, their arms stretched along the rungs, their backs exposed. Whips fell until the air itself seemed to split. Blood soaked the wood. Sobs and screams echoed in courtyards, in barracks, in fields. Confessions were forced, written down by clerks, added to the growing web of accusation. Some confessed to burning Havana, though no fire had been lit. Others named men who had never even spoken of revolt. But in the eyes of the authorities, the truth did not matter. What mattered was control. The fear spread so far that even planters began to doubt. Was there really a grand conspiracy? Or had they themselves fed hysteria with their paranoia? For them, the answer mattered little. The repression had already become its own justification. By the end of 1844, Cuba was scarred. Entire communities were shattered. Some of the island's most prominent free men of color were executed or exiled. Families carried grief that could not be spoken aloud. And in the cane fields, the scars on men's backs told stories that no archive would ever fully record. Yet memory survived. Even when silence was forced, stories traveled in whispers. The story of La Escalera was told not in books but in scars, in the songs that carried hidden meanings, in the prayers that asked ancestors for strength. The Spanish had tried to erase rebellion. Instead, they had carved its memory deeper. Because the truth was this: La Escalera may have been born in 1844, but its roots stretched far deeper, and its legacy stretched far beyond. It was not just about Cuba. It was about the human will to resist, the refusal to accept bondage as destiny, the courage to dream even when dreaming could cost you your life. The story of La Escalera cannot be told only through the planters' records or the officials' decrees. It must be imagined through the lives of those who endured it, the men and women whose names were rarely written, whose voices were silenced by the lash. Picture the cane fields of Matanzas. The air is heavy with heat, and the stalks tower above the workers like walls of green. Machetes swing in rhythm, not to music, but to survival. Overseers patrol on horseback, their pistols glinting in the sun, their eyes sharp for any sign of defiance. In the barracks at night, the enslaved gather in quiet. They whisper in Akan, in Yoruba, in Congo tongues, words the overseers cannot understand. They share food, songs, and stories, small acts of humanity in a world determined to strip it away. And in those stories, courage flickers like flame. Perhaps a young man remembers his grandfather's tale of war in Africa. Perhaps a woman hums a lullaby that once carried more than comfort, it carried memory. These moments are small, but they are dangerous, because they remind people that freedom once existed and therefore might exist again. For the Spanish, this is what made the Africans dangerous. Not just their strength in the fields, but their memory, their culture, their refusal to forget who they were. A man who remembers freedom cannot be enslaved quietly. So when rumors of conspiracy spread, the authorities acted not only against the body but against memory itself. Drums were banned, night gatherings outlawed, the very instruments of community and resistance were declared criminal. Yet repression breeds creativity. A whispered phrase replaces a drumbeat. A gesture across the field becomes a message. Silence itself can become a language. In 1844, silence spoke louder than words. The trials that year were not trials as we understand them. They were performances of power. Men tied to ladders confessed because their flesh could not endure more lashes. Women gave names because their children were threatened. Some told the truth, others invented lies, but all fed the machinery of fear. The Spanish claimed they uncovered hundreds of conspirators. They spoke of Havana nearly set aflame, of plantations ready to explode, of rebels plotting under every palm. But whether or not the plot was real mattered less than the punishment that followed. Planters wanted reassurance. They wanted to believe that by lashing bodies they could lash away fear. So they demanded blood, and the authorities delivered. Executions filled the plazas. Whippings echoed through the fields. La Escalera became less about uncovering a conspiracy and more about proving control. But what is control built on fear? It is fragile, like sugar glass, glittering until the moment it shatters. For those who lived through it, 1844 was unforgettable. Some carried scars across their backs for the rest of their lives. Others carried memories of brothers or sisters who never returned from the barracks. Children grew up with stories of that year whispered in cautionary tones, warnings not to trust, not to speak too loudly, not to dream too boldly. And yet, those same stories also carried something else: proof. Proof that people had dared to imagine freedom. Proof that even in the darkest moment, the will to resist had flickered. That flicker could not be extinguished. It would pass into the next generation and the next, until finally, the flames would rise again. The Spanish may have called it La Escalera, but to the enslaved, it was something different. It was a reminder that empire was not invincible, that masters were not gods, that the fight for freedom was older than the chains that bound them. The lash may have silenced voices in 1844, but silence was never complete. Beneath the terror, people remembered. Memory became resistance, carried not in books or papers, but in whispers. In songs, sung softly to children, in the way eyes met across a field. In Havana, the repression fell hardest on free men of color. Teachers, poets, and artisans were accused of feeding rebellion with their ideas. Some were jailed, others executed, others exiled. Their names were erased from official records, yet in the barrios their memory lingered. In the countryside, suspicion poisoned the air. An enslaved man might be seized simply for pausing too long at the well or for exchanging a word in a language the overseer did not understand. Overseers saw rebellion in every glance, every silence. Fear turned them crueler, and cruelty fed more fear. The latter became a tool of theater. Men were tied in the plazas, whipped until their blood soaked the wood, forced to confess before a crowd. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed not in secret but in spectacle. The colony demanded obedience through fear carved into flesh. Yet what the Spaniards could never fully understand was that fear works both ways. For every man whipped on the ladder, another learned that obedience offered no safety. For every woman accused unjustly, others realized silence did not protect them. If punishment came regardless, then rebellion remained the only path left. La Escalera, meant to destroy the spirit of freedom, became proof of its persistence. For the enslaved, survival itself was defiance. Each day endured was a refusal to surrender. Each story remembered was a quiet victory over empire's attempt at silence. By year's end, Cuba was scarred. Hundreds dead, thousands maimed, entire families broken. But something else had happened too. The mask of empire had slipped. The Spanish had revealed the truth. They ruled not through loyalty, not through justice, but through fear. And fear is always a fragile throne. After 1844, Cuba was never the same. The lash had left scars not just on bodies, but on the island's very soul. La Escalera became a wound whispered about for decades, a year so feared that elders lowered their voices when they spoke of it. The Spanish crown celebrated their victory. Officials boasted that they had discovered and destroyed the greatest slave conspiracy in Cuba's history. They tightened laws, patrolled plantations, and restricted gatherings. But what they really revealed was their fear that Haiti's fire might one day burn in Havana's streets. New decrees outlawed drumming, dancing, and night meetings. The instruments of joy became crimes, for colonists believed they could hide rebellion by silencing culture. Overseers carried stricter orders, soldiers patrolled villages, and priests thundered from pulpits that obedience was holy while rebellion was sin. Yet, culture is stubborn. Songs found new rhythms, hiding messages in claps and steps. Families whispered prayers in African tongues, even as priests demanded silence. Stories of courage were told not in public squares, but in kitchens, in barracks, in the shadows where memory could not be erased. Among free people of color, suspicion never faded. Artists, teachers, and writers were watched closely, their words censored, their gatherings disrupted. Some fled the island, carrying with them both grief and memory. Others stayed, knowing every line they spoke, every poem they recited was under watchful eyes. But even under repression, ideas spread. News of revolts in other colonies reached Cuba, in Jamaica, in Guyana, in Brazil. Each story was proof that resistance was not unique, that the will to fight was as vast as the Atlantic itself. For planners, 1844 was supposed to be the end of fear. In truth, it deepened their paranoia. Every harvest, every night fire, every unexplained whisper seemed like a spark waiting to become a blaze. They slept with pistols by their beds, locked their doors, and watched the people they enslaved with restless suspicion. For the enslaved, 1844 was a lesson carved in pain. They learned that empire's cruelty had no limits. They learned that silence offered no safety. And they learned that even crushed rebellions left behind a memory stronger than chains. Children grew up hearing the warnings of their elders: never trust the masters, never forget the past, never stop dreaming of freedom. The year of the lash became more than history. It became a code, a reminder that the struggle continued in every generation. The Spanish archives reduced La Escalera to cold lines: mutiny uncovered, rebels punished, order restored. But the enslaved carried another record: scars on their backs, empty places at family fires, songs that remembered even when words could not. And in that hidden archive, the true meaning of La Escalera survived. It was not only a year of terror, it was proof that the enslaved had already imagined freedom, had already planned to take it, had already dared to fight for it, and no amount of lashes could erase that truth. Years passed after 1844, but the shadow of La Escalera lingered like a storm that never cleared. In the plantations, people still pointed to the ladder when speaking of cruelty, a symbol that needed no explanation. In Havana, officials walked proudly, claiming victory, but even their pride was mixed with dread. The planters lived with ghosts. Every night when the wind rustled through the cane, they imagined footsteps. When drums echoed faintly in the distance, their hearts tightened. They had silenced a generation, but they knew silence could not last forever. Fear became their constant companion. For the enslaved, memory became survival. Elders told children about 1844 in fragments, careful not to speak too loudly. They said, "Never forget what happened when we dreamed of freedom, but also never forget that we did dream." The story became both a warning and a spark. Some spoke of men who stood proudly on the ladder, refusing to scream even under the lash. Some remembered women who carried messages across fields, risking their lives so that others might rise. These stories, though whispered, gave strength. They reminded the young that their ancestors had been more than victims. They had been fighters. In the cities, suspicion of free people of color never faded. Officials passed laws to restrict their movement, to monitor their work, to silence their voices. Yet despite the repression, Havana's neighborhoods remained alive with music, craft, and quiet defiance. Even when censored, the idea of dignity could not be erased. La Escalera also reached across the Atlantic. In Spain, officials debated whether the colony could truly be controlled. They feared not just Cuban rebels, but the ripple effect. What if news of 1844 encouraged uprisings in Puerto Rico or in other corners of empire? The fear spread further than the lash could reach. But repression has a price. Every act of cruelty hardened resentment. Every scar became a reminder that empire was built on lies. The Spanish believed they had restored order, but they had in fact deepened the wound, making rebellion not less likely, but more inevitable. For decades afterward, whenever whispers of conspiracy arose, planters invoked La Escalera. They said, "Remember 1844, remember the terror." They used it as justification for more patrols, more soldiers, more cruelty. The latter became not just a memory, but a weapon, wielded again and again to keep people silent. And yet, silence was never complete. Songs carried hidden meanings, stories traveled in secret. Each generation inherited the memory of 1844, and with it, the knowledge that freedom had been dreamed once before, and therefore could be dreamed again. The Spaniards had tried to bury rebellion under fear. Instead, they planted a seed that lay waiting in the soil of Cuba's history. That seed would grow slowly, in whispers and scars, until the day the island itself rose against empire. Life after 1844 was marked by silence that felt heavier than chains. In the barracks, people lowered their voices when soldiers passed, but their eyes still spoke. A mother would hush her child, not only out of caution, but because she knew too well that a single careless word could bring soldiers to the door. The cane fields carried memories. Every scar on a man's back told a story. Every limp in an elder's step whispered of the ladder. Overseers thought the lash had broken them, but in truth, it had written history on their skin. And every day those scars were seen, the story survived. Children grew up learning to read fear like others learned to read letters. They watched their parents' faces when drums sounded in the distance. They heard songs sung in half whispers, lullabies that carried not just comfort but fragments of memory. "Do not forget," the elders said, "but do not speak too loudly." Daily work in the fields seemed unchanged, cutting cane, carrying loads, tending the boiling houses. But beneath the surface, nothing was the same. People no longer trusted even their closest neighbors for fear that an innocent word might be twisted into evidence. Suspicion was as common as hunger. Still, defiance found small ways to live. A worker might pause a heartbeat longer before obeying an overseer's order. A woman might slip an extra handful of food to a starving child. A man might carve a symbol into wood, a secret reminder that freedom was not forgotten. At night, when the overseers slept, whispers carried again. They spoke of Haiti, of Africa, of ancestors who had fought before. The Spanish tried to forbid memory, but memory travels where no soldier can follow. Around the fire, stories continued. Around the fire, freedom still lived. And as years passed, a strange thing happened. The very silence that planters had forced began to work against them, because silence meant people carried their thoughts inside, hidden from view, where they could not be controlled. And in that silence, the dream of freedom grew stronger, sharper, harder to kill. So when the Spanish looked out over their plantations and saw bowed heads, they told themselves the lash had worked. But in truth, those bowed heads hid eyes that still burned. The silence of 1844 was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of waiting. For the Spanish rulers, 1844 was meant to be the end of fear. They told themselves the conspiracy was crushed, that the lash had secured obedience, that silence had been restored. But history does not obey decrees. La Escalera became a ghost that haunted Cuba long after the screams faded. In the halls of government, officials whispered about it whenever tension rose. Governors warned the crown that another Escalera could ignite if vigilance weakened. Militia captains drilled their men with the memory of 1844 as a lesson. Fear was the foundation of their order. Even decades later, the latter remained in their nightmares. For planters, it became a word that explained every act of cruelty. When they demanded harsher punishments, they invoked Escalera. When they argued for more soldiers, they invoked Escalera. It was their justification, their shield, their excuse. But every time they spoke the name, they confessed their weakness. They were afraid. Among the enslaved, the word carried a different weight. Escalera was not just terror, it was proof. Proof that their people had once dreamed of rising together, proof that they had forced empire to tremble. The elders told it quietly, shaping it into both warning and inspiration. Remember the lash, they said, but remember also the courage. That memory passed into the next generation. A boy growing up in the fields learned that silence could not erase dignity. A girl born in the city learned that fear could not erase pride. In their veins ran the whispers of 1844, unbroken, unstoppable. By the late 19th century, when Cuba's independence movements gathered strength, the ghost of Escalera still lingered. Rebels who fought against Spain carried with them the knowledge that resistance was not new. It had been born long before, in the barracks, in the fields, in the year of the lash. The Spanish wanted La Escalera to be forgotten. Instead, they had written it into Cuba's soul. For the enslaved and their descendants, it became a chapter of memory that no archive could erase. For the empire, it remained a scar, a reminder that power built on fear is power built on sand. In the villages, memory lived in the simplest of places. An old woman, sitting by a cooking fire, would hum a song that her mother had once whispered during the dark nights of 1844. The children gathered around did not know all the words, but they felt the weight in her voice. They knew the song carried something deeper than lullabies. A grandfather, scarred across his back, would trace his fingers along the lines of old wounds when his grandson asked where they came from. He did not speak of torture directly, such words were dangerous, but he would say, "These are reminders that we were never silent." The boy carried those words like armor. In the cane fields, men still spoke cautiously as they worked, but sometimes when the overseer was far, they whispered about the night of fire. One would say, "My uncle was there." Another would nod, "My aunt carried messages." These fragments were not written in any book, but they built a secret history that refused to vanish. At night, mothers warned their daughters, "Be careful what you say." But they also added softly, "Do not forget who we are." Between the caution and the pride, a balance was struck, a way to survive under empire without surrendering identity. In Havana's barrios, free men of color carried the memory in a different way. They wrote poems with hidden meanings, painted symbols into designs, or taught their students lessons wrapped in metaphor. Outwardly, they obeyed the colonial laws. Inwardly, they kept the fire alive. For every family broken in 1844, there were children who asked why fathers never came home or why mothers cried at night. The answers were not always spoken aloud, but the silence itself became a lesson. Silence said, "We have suffered, but we have not forgotten." La Escalera was not just a year. It became part of daily life, carried in scars, in stories, in songs half sung, in glances exchanged under the eyes of soldiers. The Spanish could outlaw drums, forbid gatherings, silence the press, but they could not stop memory from flowing quietly through the people. And so, in kitchens, in fields, in classrooms, the rebellion lived on, not as a loud cry, but as a quiet rhythm of survival. Each generation inherited not just pain, but also the knowledge that their ancestors had dared to fight. By the late 1800s, Cuba was no longer the same island that had trembled in 1844. The sugar empire had grown even larger, wealthier, and more ruthless. But beneath the weight of empire, the memory of La Escalera still pulsed, a hidden current shaping the island's future. Young Cubans of color, born decades after 1844, grew up hearing the whispers of that year. Some were the grandchildren of those who had been lashed on the ladder. Others carried only fragments of stories, half-remembered songs, a warning spoken by elders. Yet these fragments became seeds of identity, proof that rebellion had a history. As Cuba's independence movement gained strength in the second half of the century, La Escalera became a shadow in the background. Rebels who fought against Spain drew courage from the knowledge that resistance did not begin with them. It had roots in the fields and fires of 1844. In revolutionary circles, the story was often disguised, told in metaphors so the censors would not recognize it, but the meaning was clear. If enslaved men and women had dared to rise against impossible odds, then surely free men and women could rise too. For the Spanish rulers, Escalera remained a scar of fear. Even in the 1870s and 1880s, colonial officials warned Madrid of plots that reminded them of 1844. The name itself had become shorthand for rebellion, invoked whenever paranoia grew. In their fear, they revealed how deeply the lash of 1844 had carved into their minds. But for the oppressed, it was no longer only a warning. It had become a source of pride. The rebels of 1844 had not won, but they had proved that empire could be shaken. That idea could not be erased, and it burned quietly until the great wars of independence set the island ablaze. La Escalera was supposed to end resistance. Instead, it became part of Cuba's long road to freedom, a chapter of suffering transformed into a lesson of courage. And when the final battles for independence came, the ghost of 1844 marched with them. History often tries to bury the voices of the defeated. In the official archives of Spain, La Escalera is reduced to cold phrases, a conspiracy punished, order restored. But if you listen closely, you can still hear what the paper could not silence, the cries of men and women who refused to bow even when facing the whip, the ladder, and the fire. Their names may be forgotten, their faces may have vanished into time, but their courage lingers like smoke that never fully clears. La Escalera was not just a moment of brutality, it was a mirror. It revealed both the cruelty of empire and the resilience of those forced beneath it. It showed that even when terror reigns, the human spirit finds ways to resist, through whispers, through memory, through the stubborn refusal to accept chains as destiny. And though the rebellion of 1844 ended in pain, its story traveled beyond the sugar fields of Cuba. It lived in the songs of the oppressed, in the nightmares of the colonizers, and in the dreams of those who later took up arms for independence. La Escalera did not crush hope. It planted it, watered it with sacrifice, and left it to grow in the shadows until the day it could bloom again. So as we close this chapter, remember, history is not only written by the victors, it is also carried in the scars, in the whispers, and in the fire that refuses to die. If this story moved you, don't let it stay buried in silence. Share it, so others can hear the voices that empire tried to erase. And if you want to keep uncovering forgotten tales of resistance, survival, and defiance, subscribe and stay with us, because every story we remember brings us closer to honoring the fight for freedom.